Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event today on a new vision for leadership, collective action to tackle the crisis of today and tomorrow. I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive of ODI Global, and we have a fantastic group of people gathered here in Davos on the sidelines of the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, but we also are live streaming this conversation or part of this conversation through the ODI website. So a big welcome also to our online audience that is very large today. We're delighted to partner again with Mastercard. This leadership conversation is becoming a fixture here in Davos, and it is such an important conversation. That's why we continue to try and gather the best minds of Davos, I think, to see what we can do. And I'm really grateful to all the executives that they're with us around the table, because Davos schedules are really packed. I know everybody is frantic, and so to find an hour to be here, reflect together on the challenges of today is really, really important. I mean, we reached out to each of you who is here around the table because you are all leaders that really strived to go beyond your field, beyond your sector, to really try and create collective leadership. And collective leadership is really what is needed now more than ever to really address a number of, I think, existential challenges that we're facing, from the climate crisis to, the deepening inequality, new forms of poverty, conflicts are spiraling everywhere. And of course, the pandemic has deepened further all of this and has created this wave of isolationism and nationalism, with a lot of countries turning inwards. And as a result, what we're seeing is demagogues, they are exploiting division, they're fostering discord, they are eroding trust in institutions, trust in political life. And so without collective action, we can't really move towards a more progressive and inclusive world. We need that compassionate leadership. We need that genuine accountability. We need a shared vision to inspire leaders, to inspire the communities, to really try and build a future that is founded on the values of solidarity, of integrity, and responsibility. And just before the first leadership conversation here last year, in December 2023, at ODI, we launched Tandem Leadership, which is really our executive leadership program for humanitarian and development professionals. This really focuses on trying to equip and inspire leaders to tackle crisis better, to inspire others, to work better. And we've just, graduated one cohort, and the new cohort is just started. So the conversation today is really to try and reflect on how we can redefine leadership together to build trust, to inspire collective action, and really hear from all of you what has inspired you. What have you seen these best examples of, catalyst systemic change that others can learn from? As usual, in our conversation, we'll have a live stream segment with our speakers here today, and then we move into the private conversation, because sometimes to really forge collective action, we need to be candid, and being off camera allows us to be a little bit more direct. So we'll start by hearing from our really special guests, speakers there around the table, hearing their own reflections of their leadership journeys. I'm really delighted to introduce them, starting with Tom Fletcher. Tom is the UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Emergency Relief Coordinator, newly minted almost, back in November. To my left, Kiki Del Valle, Division President for North Latin America of Mastercard, partner in crime. Next to Kiki Vilasdar, friend, colleague, another partner in crime, president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And next to Tom is Misha Addi, co-founder and CEO of Jetstream Africa. Let's get started. Tom, I'll start with you. So I just said you've been in post for 2 months now. One great thing about your appointment, that I reacted to was like someone from outside the sector. This incestuous conversation that we've had for a long time within the humanitarian sector, someone that can bring a different perspective. So what are your plans to go beyond what has been done before, the traditional way of the humanitarian sector? How are you going to leverage this collaboration from outside the sector, both to address the short-term crisis, but also to build for the long-term governance, sort of education, economic opportunities, which is actually what a lot of people in crisis really want.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, and hi, everyone. And thanks for bringing us together this afternoon. I mean, that's the existential question, really, for the humanitarian sector, for the humanitarian community, but actually for the humanitarian movement. And, I'm conscious there are different circles that this humanitarian mission brings together. And my job within the UN is coordinating that UN family. But it's very clear that in this, welcome to the driverless world, in the context we're in now, an age, as you say, of distrust, of inequality, of tech uncertainty, the UN family itself is not going to be able to fix these problems alone. I've been saying I feel like, our job as humanitarians is to drive the ambulance, but the world has now asked us to drive the fire engine too, to actually go out and put out some of these fires. No one seems to be working to end all these wars, but we're doing that at a time when, the ambulance and the fire engine don't have any fuel. We're underfunded, we're overstretched, and we're literally under attack. People are firing at the fire engine as we go out there to try and put these fires out. So that is a pretty bleak and daunting prospect. And my to-do list, we launched in December the overview of humanitarian needs. It's 300 million people on that list. And if we raised 47 billion, we could hopefully support 190 million of them. But we're not going to raise 47 billion, not in my wildest fantasies. So that bit of the circle is just not going to be up to doing it on its own. So we do need to draw in, therefore, these other circles, the wider humanitarian community, but also then to mobilize a humanitarian movement way beyond that and to make these crucial alliances. If we are in a phase where the US, which has been the biggest donor, the biggest supporter of the humanitarian effort since the Second World War, are going to go into a period of retreat and introversion and inwardness, then actually the private sector will become our largest donor by default, even if they don't spend any more money supporting this effort. So you've got to join the dots there, therefore. With the private sector, I think the key is not to be going out there asking for money, but saying, how do we solve problems together? I think that changes the conversation. I can give you a list of the problems that would keep me awake at night if I didn't take as many sleeping pills. And I think there are a whole load of those the private sector can respond to. So we've got to join those dots. But ultimately, it does come to this idea of a humanitarian movement. I think we are not in and this is not my idea, it comes from Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms. We are not in a Tetris world, a hierarchical world, a world of institutions and structures, top down. We're much more in a Minecraft world where ideas spread sideways and where you've got to build these unusual coalitions. But we've got to move beyond just saying that's a good idea to actually doing it in practice. And of course, ultimately, if we're really going to lower the bar properly to creating a humanitarian movement, the most important people to have in that movement, to be leading that movement, are the people that we're here to serve. And that means we've got to give away power and not just talk about devolving responsibility and listening, but actually giving away power to those who we're here to serve. And that is much harder to do than it is to say.
I couldn't agree more. Just before the World Humanitarian Summit at ODI, I authored a report called Time to Let Go. And it really was calling for letting go of power and control. So I'm really delighted to hear that. And yes, humanitarian movement, private sector, MasterCard has been working a lot across the space. And I mean, it's interesting. You're a massive private sector company, right? You work in 200 countries, more than 200 countries. What does it look like from your perspective? What have you learned from the experience of MasterCard working? I mean, I remember the frustrations at the beginning when MasterCard was trying to work with the humanitarian sector and going, gosh, you guys are impossible. What has actually been,
what does it look like in practice, you mean? First of all, thank you for the invitation to actually sit here in this panel. A pleasure being here. I think for those of you that don't know, MasterCard operates today in over 220 countries, so you were close. We have about 26,000 financial institutions. We have about 150 million merchant locations that today we're basically in. Our business model is built on the foundation of being a network. We rely on partnerships. We rely on not just the private sector, but also the public sector to be able to succeed. So we need to find ways to collaborate, to drive partnerships, to become even more essential to the everyday consumer lives. So at the end of the day, our mission is to make sure that we are powering economies and empowering people. That's our mantra. We do this in a way that we can bring people into the financial ecosystem. So inclusivity is foundational to the work that we do. The more access, the more cards that consumers have in their wallets, the better that they are in their everyday life, because they begin in their journey of becoming financially healthy and benefiting from additional financial services products. So everything from, you may actually start with a debit product, a bank account, but then that gives you access into savings, into lending, access to capital, insurance, and so on. So we look at it in the context of not just access and inclusivity that gives you an initial step. How do we actually then move you so that you can, from receiving a government subsidy, for example, then move into taking or benefiting from other services that the financial ecosystem can bring? So I think we've seen incredible progress in what is financial inclusion. There's still a long ways to go. For us in Latin America, which I represent, we've seen about a 20% increase in the past years alone. A lot of it accelerated from COVID, from government subsidies, where the governments played a very big role, but also from fintechs, for example, and from new players that came into the fold. Today at Mastercard in Latin America, about 300 million cards are actually driven from digital accounts, from fintech accounts. It's massive. It is one of the largest regions behind Asia in driving this digital agenda. And we saw that big leap because of the fact that most of the solutions were actually driven from digital. So I think the role that we need to play is very much hand in hand, not just with the private sector, as I said, but also with the public sector, in bringing financial literacy, in bringing new SME products that facilitate digitization, new tools, services for the PYMEs, for the little micro merchant, and then also helping bridge the gap with additional payment options that are coming to bear. So we're seeing more options with account to account, and so on. So how do we play in bringing additional choices for consumers and making sure that again, we're building in favor of that financial health in the journey for the financial consumer that we're trying to serve.
Great. That is such a neat path to Vilas, who really, you're all tech for good advocate, sort of supreme. I mean, I've seen you work across community leaders, activists, corporate, philanthropic space, and I've really seen you advance positive change across a variety of different domains. Tell us a little bit how you've gone about building these coalitions. What does it look to concretely try and bring them together to shape change more positively?
Amazing. Thanks very much, Sarah. And thanks to our panelists. I really love these conversations that you host often because I feel like they're the ones that are the most real conversations you have in about a 600-meter radius of here. And I just love them. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm glad I can be here. You asked a provocative question. I'll give you a provocative answer. Look, I lead a foundation. Our 5-word line, if you needed to hear it, is we're the largest foundation in the world focused on AI for good. I will tell you, I don't really care about AI, right? As one of the most prominent AI experts in the world, I don't really care about a tool. I have no emotional connection to it or engagement with it. I think of it often as a Trojan horse. It's a way to engage in a conversation that started here, if I think back 4 years with curiosity, and then was replaced the year after with unbridled and naive optimism, and then was replaced with existential risk, AI will kill us all, and now is back to, well, how do we use it to drive profitability? And I think that cycle is in and of itself so instructive, right? Because you could take out the words AI and learn so much about human behavior and how we're engaging with change. I think there's a couple of things that I want to say that draws from that experience without hopefully having to talk at all about AI. The first is, if we think about it as a construct of how we create the potential for new power, we've seen all of the human behavioral tropes at play, right? The curiosity, the optimism, the fear, the how do I use this for my best interest? And throughout, as those of us in the room and around the world have been advocating for more participatory practices around what we do to shape the ways these tools change our society, we see that there's engagement, and yet the volume on those conversations feels so much lower than I can drive 6% EBITDA growth. Those are the lessons I think we need to take as we experience kind of what transformation might look like, that there is real power in being able to find the narrative that inspires and creates hope outside of economic systems, and at the same time, a reality and a pragmatism that says we can't tie those things together, then we're kind of lost in the wilderness. So what's the practical outcome for that? I mean, one, I think, is to be able to actively take on narratives that say any kind of intervention, technology or otherwise, will somehow create new power by itself, that the inertia of technological progress will somehow fix humanitarian issues. Something that I've heard unironically said inside of the highest levels of some of the institutions represented here by tech CEOs and by policymakers at the most senior levels. Well, if I say I'm an optimist, and I tell you frankly that I'm not an optimist about technology, then it begs the question, what do I care about? And I'll tell you, I'm quite optimistic about human institutions. Not the ones we have today, but potentially the ones we could envision for tomorrow. Institutions that take on, I think, two twin mandates. First, an ownership of a positive and affirmative vision of what we can create. And second, the modesty and humility to say we've learned plenty of lessons from the institutions we've created so far. That even if they were created with the right intentions, have been created with structures that have, by their very definition, been exclusionary, have been weighted towards those who have more economic power, have been weighted in ways that don't really let communities have significant voice. The second part of it, I would say, is, and now you're getting a lot of angst from me, I don't really know the difference between a public live stream conversation or a private one. I just say my things. I mean, I think the second part of it is I want to make sure that we remain cautious of the idea that the sources of power, because they are powerful and because they claim to represent all of us, don't necessarily do so. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I was in a conversation with tech CEOs yesterday and said, you know, we are really wanting to address the digital divide. And the way we'll do it is we are going to go into countries around the world and build capacity. In that context, we'll build data centers and skills. And I think on face, you can look at that and say, what a wonderful set of initiatives. We will fix the capacity gap. And yet I'm also struck by the fact that when I sit down with the presidents and prime ministers of those very countries, they say, you know, what happened was I had somebody come in and with the promise of technological opportunity said, this is the menu of options you can pick from. And I had to pick one of them. We think about what dignity looks like in a world where constituencies and communities are turned into consumers of change, consumers of positive progress, right? There's nothing negative to be said about it. And yet I also wonder what opportunity there would be if we moved them from consumers to architects, not of technological capacity, but of social vision, of societal opportunity, of a sense of a shared future of prosperity that is driven by our values, principles, and norms, rather than by the opportunities that are being created by external innovation. So I'll just close with the exhortation that, you know, as we sit here and with all of the talks and panels and everything else we've been to, there's so many threads about how we iterate what we have today for tomorrow, about improving institutions, about creating efficiencies. And I'll say I'm a huge proponent for that. I think that's great. And yet we also live in a world where it strikes me that the institutions we have and the practices we have, as efficient as we make them, still don't get to the core of a separate problem. One that's about agency, about dignity, about participation, about a structural shift in how we think about participation and power. And I would love to see more places where that conversation happens. Maybe it starts here. Thank you.
Perfect, wonderful. Thank you so much, Vilas. And this takes me so perfectly to Misha, because Misha, you have been one of these people that's wanted to take this conversation about agency to a different level. I mean, I've heard you speak about how Africa has been always seen as a recipient of philanthropy in a paternalistic way, you know, sort of always this sense of just almost like the North, you know, generously giving, and instead you've really been a pioneer in, you know, revolutionizing logistics, trade, bringing in the best entrepreneurship sort of skills and qualities, and then leveraging both the public and private sector. So I just want to hear from you, you know, what insights you can share from your journey that can, you know, sort of inspire others.
Thank you for having me. I was on the bus from the Zurich airport, and I met a journalist who'd been to maybe 10 Davos before, and he said, "Are you here to learn or are you here to earn?" And I thought, oh my goodness, do I have to be so specific? And I think coming to these panels and hearing people talk, as much as I run a private, it's a for-profit business, learning is really the best outcome from Davos. And I think that learning and listening is something that builds a foundation for longer term earning, and really keeping my ears open for what people are doing and hearing just the anxiety from people all around the world about the trade disruption, which is my industry, is so real. And it's so, just on a human level, it's scary for people, because it's taking their livelihoods, the way that they've built businesses, and it's scrambling it overnight. And I think that's just there's a very human reaction to that. My company does something that's called collateral management. So we are a registered freight forwarder. We help move cargo between A and B across borders, but we do that for cargo that's financed. So if a bank is giving someone a loan to do trade, we manage the cargo under that loan, and sometimes we finance it. But when I think about the most, to the topic of this discussion, the most collaborative time for us, it was during COVID. And it was a time where no one knew what was going to happen, if the world was over. All of the old trade alliances were scrambled. It was a lot like what's happening now. The suppliers who used to be able to export cargo into Africa, they didn't have the right licenses during COVID to do so. So we were working with a big pharmaceuticals distributor that ended up distributing like 60% of the COVID testing kits in Ghana. And their typical suppliers, the Chinese government changed the requirements to get medical equipment out of the country during COVID, and they were changing it like daily. And so you had a supplier, and then the next day the supplier was invalid, and so you had to go to a new supplier. So the speed at which they had to change their supply chain and change their logistics operation to get to the outcome that they wanted, which was to get COVID testing kits into the country, it was like nothing I've ever seen before. But I think we're entering an era where we're going to see more of that, where the old ways of doing things, the old partnerships are going to be rearranged by policy, by climate change, by external factors. And it'll be up to the people on the ground, like the logistics operators, the banks, et cetera, to figure out how to build new alliances across borders. But one thing that is heartening to me, and that I saw, just in the few days that I've been here at Davos, is we're all in it together. The human emotions that we feel, and being in an industry that's being disrupted, that's really universal.
Thanks. And this leads me to a very quick fire round before I open to everyone around the table on something important that you say about building these alliances. I mean, to build alliances, you need to build trust. And I'd really like to hear from each of you, what is your experience? What has worked in your leadership journey to build trust that we can all take with us? Kiki, want to start?
Sure. I think for us, trust is foundational. I mean, it's the reason why people feel secure and feel that their finances, which is one of the #1 things that people worry about, are safe, right? So at the end of the day, our brand has been built on this concept of trust with security at the forefront. So how do we ensure, and this is something that we at MasterCard have very much top of mind, how do we ensure that we can address cyber attacks, fraud attacks, not even at the transaction level only, but actually on a pre and a post transaction basis. Over the last 8 years, this has been an area that MasterCard has done incredible investments in. But to give you a sense, we're talking about in the last 2 years alone, just $20 billion in fraud, cyber risk that we at MasterCard have actually had to stop. So the threats are becoming much bigger when it comes to security. As we think about AI and how do we drive innovation, we look at the potential of AI in how it can revolutionize the inclusivity component. How do we drive that financial health piece that we're all striving for? And I am an optimist, so I would like to think that it's a problem that we will eventually get to solve. But it does take our ability for us to remain a trusted institution, and for us to protect every single node or stakeholder in our ecosystem so that we don't break that trust with the final consumer and the businesses. So I think this is it's an area that we continue investing, that we will continue focusing on, but it's one that our entire model is relying upon as well.
Interesting. Vilas.
I have a thought, and I haven't ever said this out loud before, so excuse me if it's not clear, but I think that we sometimes talk about trust as something that happens because of what we do. And I actually think that's wrong. I think the reason we think that is because trust is easily broken by when we fail to do the things we do. But I don't actually think that's how we create trust. I've been thinking about our own work, and for me, trust actually comes from something much earlier in the process, which is before you adhere to what people expect of you, how do you actually agree to what that is? What is the contract between you and your community that says, this is what I promised to you and what you promised to me? And as I think about work across our sector and across the world, I realize that we don't often spend the amount of time we should to define what the contract is inside of and between communities. We just think if we go out and do some things, eventually people will trust us and we can hold that forever. I think that's quite different from the business community, where I think you've actually evolved a process that says when we enter a market, we tell you what we will be, we tell you how we will do it, and you will judge us based on whether we do it or not. In the social sector, at least in our experience, like I wonder if that's a different starting point. What is our shared vision of what our activity should be? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to something that's named, that's actually true to both our heart and soul, but also our rational process, and go from there?
Fantastic. We'll come back to that. Misha.
I think just to build on what you said, I think that there's some foundation of trust that relies on just listening to what the other person is saying and what they need. I mean, there are some people we trust them only so far. We like expect them to let us down. But I think, of course, we mean, how do you build a positive, trusting relationship? Not that just that you can predict what's going to happen, but that you can rely on the other person in a positive way. And I think the foundation for that contract is really listening well. And I think especially in the global South, very often the expectation is that you need food, you need water, I'm going to help you figure out how to get those things my way because I'm bringing the capital. And that's almost broken trust from the get-go. So if you have enough respect for the person's intelligence, their dignity, to just listen to them tell you what they need and what they want, I think that's an important foundation for trust.
And the Global South has been saying that for so long and so loudly, and we're still not hearing it. Tom.
I mean, all of the above. I mean, I think that's a brilliant set of thoughts there. I think it is an age of distrust, and that's not always a bad thing. I mean, the agency the smartphone is giving us is one of the reasons that we are losing trust in authority and institutions and taking more power and agency ourselves. We all check with Dr. Google on the way back from seeing a doctor. We have parental WhatsApp groups, if you're my age, where we're commenting nonstop on our kids' education and so on. So it is part of taking more individual control and responsibility. And I don't think that's all bad, but it does make it very hard for those of us in institutions now. I mean, I think one thing to do is just to constantly run that test over it the whole time. Is what I'm doing gaining or losing trust? Whether you're an individual or a business or a UN agency or a government. But I think you're exactly right. A recent prime minister in the UK said to me, how can I gain more trust? And once I'd picked myself up off the floor, I said, stop doing things that are untrustworthy. That's a pretty good place to start. He ignored that completely. In our business as humanitarians, the biggest cause of burnout is not the fact that people are going towards these crises and seeing the worst of humanity. The biggest cause of burnout is the gap that people feel between the professed values of the organization and what they're actually experiencing in reality. So if you have an organization that says, we are saving the world, and what you experience is bullying and bureaucracy, then you burn out much faster than if you're charging around Darfur, trying to help the most vulnerable people. So I think that's a really important part of it. And then 2 last thoughts. I think the more as leaders there is a sense of purpose and direction, a sense of, we were here, now we're here, and here's where we're going. I find that framework often really helps me to think, how do I make sure I'm not losing trust in a situation? And I just want to really underline that point on the emotional intelligence and empathy. And with the students until 2 months ago, I was spending so much time. I used to talk about that we've all got this Instagram filter. And once you can look around a table and realize that everyone else has a different Instagram filter to you and take off your filter, then you develop, that helps you develop emotional intelligence and empathy. And those are the things that probably won't be automated even by the best AI for a few more weeks yet. But if we get, and this is from my old world, if we do more of that in education, then we'll develop first-class humans, not second-class robots.
Brilliant. And interestingly, these comments are taking us to the conversation we had last year, where the importance of listening, of the emotional intelligence, the empathy were coming out very strongly as traits of leadership that were really critical. I'm afraid for our online audience, that's where we stop, because we're going to go into the private conversation. So thank you very much. I hope that these thoughts have been useful in stimulating in your own leadership journeys. So you will, the recording will be online, so if you want to share it with others in a few hours, I think.